So welcome everyone to part 3 of our day-long spring rendezvous with Citizens Climate Lobby Canada. We have Angie Nussey back again to sing for us. She doesn't know what she's doing, just like us. So she has an album. There's all sorts of information inside of your conference booklet. I encourage you to find her on Spotify, Google her name, listen to her music. It's sustained me this last decade. So it's all yours, Angie.
That was such a great intro. Thank you. Yes, I have a new album out. It started as a joke called I Have No Idea What I'm Doing. And it just had to be the title of the album. So it's coming out on Thursday for real, but you can find it on my website too. I am so lucky to be part of this day. It's just, it's so exciting. Like I got so excited, I felt like a golden lab, you know, when they cry when you pet them. I felt like that, listening to Celine and Marlo. You did a great job with your presentation there. But yeah, there's just these solutions and they're just so real and possible. And we're in this really wobbly experience where these things can come true. And it's just a really exciting moment. The other thing that I've been really excited about is how if we ever needed proof that there is a climate crisis, or that we can turn things around, COVID's given us that. It was so exciting to see rivers with fish in them all of a sudden, and measurable differences in emissions. Just in case obviously I'm speaking to the choir here, but so many naysayers on the climate change front, and there's just such inevitable proof now, and also the proof of how quickly things can turn around. It's just so exciting. COVID has given us that great gift of data collection for amazing things to happen. This song was written years ago because I think I've always believed in us. I've always believed in humans. We're evolving. We're trying our best. And I think we're going somewhere. So I can't wait for the rest of the afternoon. Thank you so much. This song is called Still Hope. There are people who have started planting gardens in their backyards, engineers designing newer houses from the scrapyards, buyers who are slowly becoming more aware of the businesses who share in responsible ways. There are restaurants who won't support the scraping of our oceans, farmers treating livestock like they're one of Earth's creations, soldiers who can understand the innocence and truth in the face of every child. There is still hope, there is still light, there is still good in each and every one, even if it is a long shot. May I always be one of the million who still believe. Can you hear me okay? Okay. There are people finding ways of sharing wealth among all nations, doctors seeking out affordable solutions, companies who've stopped releasing their emissions regardless of Kyoto, regardless of the cost. There are governments allowing cars to run on other fuels, nonpartisan words spoken in the public schools, children urging parents to seek peace among the races, peace among their neighbors, and peace within themselves. There is still hope, there is still light, there is still good in each and every one, even if it is a long shot. May I always be one of the million, one of the million. Thank you.
It's all yours, Vanessa.
Oh, thanks so much. Hello, everyone. So my name is Vanessa Fiore. Kathy, thank you so much for allowing me to facilitate during this time. So for those of you who I haven't met before, I am from Vaughan, Ontario. I'm a 21-year-old university student. I just finished my third year in the environmental science program at the University of Ottawa. And I've actually been a part of CCL since I was 16 years old. So it's been a number of years now. I joined in 2016 and the reason I joined was because I always knew I wanted to get involved in climate advocacy and specifically lobbying and getting involved in politics. So I thought CCL was the perfect way to do that. And I was definitely right with that because it's such a strong community of people who have a range of experience with lobbying. And so it's definitely helped shape me into the advocate that I am today. So I'm very grateful. And one thing that I actually wanted to mention is I just like to do the acknowledgement of traditional territory. So I'm coming to you from the Huron-Wendat and Anishinaabe lands. And so I'm back in my hometown from Vaughan. This is also my first time facilitating, so everyone bear with me. It's a lot of pressure, but so I just wanted to introduce the following presenters who will be discussing the topic of climate lawsuits globally and domestically. So we've got two presenters for this. Can everyone hear me good? Is that okay? Awesome, perfect. So one of the presenters is Dr. Dianne Saxe, and she is actually one of Canada's most respected environmental lawyers, and she was the independent environmental commissioner of Ontario from 2015 to 2019, and she currently heads the Saxe Law Professional Corporation, and she also hosts Green Economy Heroes podcast, so definitely check that out if you haven't heard of it. I'd also like to introduce Danielle Gallant. I hope I said her last name right. And she is a staff lawyer at EcoJustice, which is Canada's largest environmental law charity. And she started working there in 2018, where she's been involved in carbon pricing reference cases. She also holds a master's degree in global sustainability and environmental law at the University of Ottawa. So she's a fellow Gigi. And there she focused on, so is Kathy, yes. And there she focused on human rights dimensions of environmental issues and climate legislation. So without further ado, I'm looking forward to seeing the presentation.
Okay, can you see my slides? Yes, good, okay, great. So thank you very much for having me. Congratulations, everybody. I've been able to be part of listen to some of it. It's been really interesting. So these are the 3 points. I've only got 10 minutes. It's a 10-minute summary of a 45-minute talk, but basically the role that litigation can play in climate accountability and climate liability. And so number one, law starts with a moral case. Second, when governments and courts want to make polluters pay, they can. And the third is that lawsuits against governments can help push governments to act. So law always starts with a moral case. I mean, judges don't always admit it out loud, but it always begins with what they think is right. And this is a case where we have foreseeability, which is the moral glue of tort, enormous foreseeable damages, urgent financial demands. We know the cause, and increasingly we know who's at fault. And what's really critical is we're beginning to recognize as a society that the enormous profits that these companies have been made immorally. So we've got plausible parties, we've got no shortage of sympathetic plaintiffs, we've got really clear evidence now that the carbon majors, about 100 companies around the world, are responsible for the majority, or at least have produced the fossil fuels, which cause the majority of the climate pollution, which is driving us towards many disasters right now. And then, of course, the banks that finance them as well. But these companies have made, and in some cases, most cases continue to make, just truly astonishing money, piles of profits, which they're taking out of the pockets of all of us at the very same time that they're destroying our future. So ExxonMobil is just the most obvious example. They've produced fossil fuels that are responsible for 3% of global emissions. And just last year alone, their gross profit was $56 billion US. So a number of people have got very, very rich through this process, but those profits were not earned morally. We increasingly know that Exxon has known the evidence and basically has lied and blocked at every stage. So if you haven't read Merchants of Doubt, it's certainly worth checking out. The fossil fuel industry lobbying is the single largest barrier to effective climate action, including in Canada. We know that they meet constantly with the Canadian government. Environmental Defense showed they met 11,000 times, 2011, 2017. If you look for the stats on how often they've been on the federal government door just the last few weeks as they ask for $30 billion more, it's just truly astonishing. So they have a lot of money. They've used that money to pay lobbyists. Those lobbyists are constantly in the face and on the phone of decision makers in every federal and provincial government. And what they want would dramatically increase our pollution. And they also, they put out a wish list just this last spring asking for destruction of a whole range of environmental laws, basically the same thing they're getting from Mr. Trump in the US. They're still actively campaigning against a whole series of environmental laws, not just climate laws, basically everything I've spent my whole career working for. And what's really infuriating about it is that the fossil fuel industry has made these enormous fortunes depending on a century of public investment, public innovation, public resources, on top of expropriating our climate and continuing subsidies. Even in Ontario, as I reported to the legislature in my very first report, fossil fuels get subsidies of about $625 million a year that's coming out of your taxes to subsidize the use of fossil fuels, and they pay nothing for their pollution except when they have a price on carbon. What's really pivotal at the moment is that the fossil fuel industries are becoming less profitable for investors. When the fossil fuel industries were an enormously reliable source of money, it was very difficult to find many people who would stand against them. But a lot has changed. When I was a young lawyer, the oil industries, the energy industries were 1/4 of the stock market. This year, they're less than 5%. So they've become more and more marginal. Even Exxon's share price is down by half since last year. Moody's downgraded Exxon in the fall, citing a whole bunch of things, including litigation risk. So what I want you to understand is that there's a reason why these companies are becoming less profitable. It's not an accident. It's the hard work of many people who care about these issues. Some of it's pollution regulations, the very kind that Mr. Trump is destroying and that the oil industry here wants destroyed. Renewables and efficiency, cutting demand and therefore price at the margin, tremendously important. Litigation risk is definitely part of it. Divestment, we've got this huge and incredibly successful campaign of institutions around the world divesting from fossil fuels. And if you have a pension, an interest in a pension, very important to be pushing your pension plan to get out of fossil fuels. Good for your future, good for our climate. And if you want help on that, Shift provides classes on that. And then their cost of capital is increasing as these other things are occurring. So when governments and courts want to make polluters pay, they can. Here's a few of the examples. I don't really have time to talk about them in any length. But one thing you should know, I presume that most people here, well, a lot of people are going to be in Ontario for sure. But under the Ontario Environmental Protection Act right now, not that this government will do it, but they have the legal power to issue climate cleanup orders to the fossil fuel producers because of the wording of the statute. And we know that governments can use these orders to protect their own pocketbook. And we have a famous case on this in Quebec where Imperial Oil left a whole batch of contamination behind when they closed a refinery, which was sold to somebody else. The government didn't supervise very well, put a subdivision on it. The homeowners moved in, and they found that they were living on very contaminated land. So they sued the government. Now, what the government then turned around to do was to say, well, you know what? We don't want to have to pay for this. Even the lawsuit didn't win. They didn't finish the lawsuit. They didn't have to finish the lawsuit. Just the fact that this lawsuit was going ahead, if the government wasn't able to get rid of it quickly, they decided they needed to take action. They didn't want to pay for it themselves, so they made Imperial do it. Now, this went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada because it was pretty clear that everything the oil company had done, it may have been immoral and polluting, but it wasn't illegal at the time that they did it. There was no law in 1979 that required them to clean up this contamination. So the amazing thing is this went to the Supreme Court of Canada and they said, polluters owe a duty to future generations. Retroactive polluter liability is okay. The orders don't need to be fair. Governments can protect their own pockets when they decide how to use their powers. And that could all apply to the fossil fuel polluters. We've also got lessons we can take from the tobacco litigation. There's a tremendously important case in Quebec, which ordered the tobacco companies to pay $15 billion in damages to smokers in Quebec. I don't know whether they've paid any of it yet. But the analysis of the court, 623 pages of it, is remarkably similar to what we know is true of the fossil fuel industries. They failed to warn smokers of what they knew would be the health consequences. They actively created doubt and delay about the true science. They undermined accurate warnings. They attacked science and scientists. They successfully put off regulation through intense lobbying, thereby enormously increasing health damage while fattening their own profits. But their profits were retroactively seen to have been immoral, but only once the product became unnecessary. When smoking rates in Quebec went from well over 50% to down below 20%, most people realized they could live without cigarettes. At that point, it became politically possible for the judges to recognize that what these companies were doing was immoral. And so that's where lawsuits can come in. So here are two sources if you want to see more information about climate change lawsuits around the world. These are two very, very good organizations. The Sabin Center for Climate Change Law, and they run two databases, one on litigation in the US, one on litigation around the world. A lot of that is aimed at stopping individual projects like export terminals for coal plants or coal-fired plant permits, which has been tremendously helpful in leading to so many coal plant closures and so few new coal plants being built in the United States. The Grantham Research Institute, just fabulous resource on what's happening around the world. But we do know that even though most climate lawsuits fail, they make change possible. There are more than 1,500 lawsuits now listed in these resources, many of them blocking bad projects, some of them dealing with non-disclosure and misrepresentation. But what's really making a difference is that causation is getting clearer. Event attribution is getting clearer. It's easier and easier for scientists to say, this disaster happened at least in part because of climate change. The flooding in Hurricane Harvey in Houston, we know made much more likely because of climate change. And as the disasters continue, and we know there are going to be lots more disasters, and as the attribution becomes clearer, we get to the point where judges are now able for the very first time to say, I know this is affecting people alive today because they won't make decisions for future generations. And I know who's at fault, and it's those guys. And those are two critical bases for any kind of litigation, which are starting to make things happen. So what lawyers call this question is justiciability. Is climate action something for courts, or is it just something for politicians? And these are very tough questions because there's a lot of reasons why in a perfect world you wouldn't have large public policy decisions made by judges. Judges, by and large, didn't like science in high school. They've got no ability to understand the larger social context. They've got no accountability for public resources. They can't set taxes. They can't, I mean, there's a lot of problems with them. And although we know that money has an enormous power in the political context, it also has enormous power in the judicial context. If you can pay for witnesses, if you can pay for data collection, if you can pay for good lawyers, if you can give those lawyers time to prepare, much better chance of succeeding. And who has most of the money? So anyway, a lot of reasons why litigation is not ideal, but I think it was Bill McKibben who said, well, when you're really late in an important game and you're losing, you don't just follow the old strategy. Because if you keep following the old strategy, you'll keep losing, probably. And so when it's late in the game and you're losing, it's time to try new things, even if they're risky. And that's where we are right now. We're late in the climate game and we're losing. So it's time to try new strategies, and litigation can be one of those. And there's cases around the world. Here's a few of them. And this question, will the courts take action or not, is one where courts have a really hard time. So, but they are accepting jurisdiction in some places. We have seen some important decisions that are paving the way for other people. The agenda case in the Netherlands being really, really clear, very, very important precedent upheld by their Supreme Court in December. Keep waiting for the Philippines Human Rights Commission. They said they were going to be releasing their decision in December, and I haven't seen it yet. But anyway, there's things happening. But the key thing I wanted you to know is that whether or not you win the case, there's a lot of different ways for lawsuits to help. They normalize the conversation about youth and climate damage and accountability. You can get admissions and establish facts. The federal government pleading in the LaRose lawsuit, very important. Even if the government changes at the next election, it would be hard for the next government, no matter how right-wing they are, to withdraw those admissions. So you get some lines in the sand, you get some facts decided. You get access to documents that otherwise are secret that can help prove really important things. And you get critical opportunities for negotiation with people in power. So no matter what happens, if you can get past the first post of being kicked quickly out of the courts, lawsuits can make a difference. So there you go. There's a moral case for making the carbon majors pay. When governments want polluters to pay, they've got lots of tools to make it happen, and lawsuits can help push governments to act. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dianne. That was wonderful and very insightful. I'd like to introduce, just for the record, everyone, we're going to be holding off questions until the end of all the presentations, so feel free to ask your questions in the chat, but we'll just pick it back up after the presentations. I'd like to introduce the next presenter, Danielle Gallant, whenever you're ready.
Great. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm getting some thumbs up, so great. Thank you so much, Vanessa, for the kind introduction, and Angie for the musical introduction. I don't think I've ever had one of those before, so that was awesome. I'm not sure if a territorial acknowledgement has been done for Ottawa yet, so I just wanted to acknowledge that I am speaking to you today from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin people. Unfortunately, I don't have a great background or PowerPoint to share with you today, but hopefully you'll still find my presentation somewhat useful. Now that Dr. Sachs has kind of laid the context for climate litigation at a global scale, I will provide a brief overview of the Canadian case that I've been working on before you get a chance to hear from, I believe we're still hearing from Alex and Sophia, is that right? Great, about their own experience. And I know you're all excited to hear from them, as am I. So please bear with me for about 10 minutes of lawyer speak, and then I'll turn it over to them. So first of all, I wanted to contextualize how this case came about, and then discuss some of the main points of the case before describing what's happened so far and what the next steps are. So generally, in the success of our agenda, which Dr. Sachs alluded to in the Netherlands and other climate cases throughout the world, has really prompted many environmental law scholars and lawyers such as myself to ask, would it be possible to hold our own governments to account for their inaction in our own jurisdictions? and what legal tools are available to do so and have the most chance of success. And in Canada, most legal scholars agreed that the most powerful tool in our legal toolbox is Section 7 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is enshrined in our Constitution. And this right protects our right to life, liberty, and security of the person. And now what's special about Section 7 is that it has successfully been argued in recent years in relation to many complex and sometimes even controversial societal issues like prostitution, medically assisted death, and safe injection sites. So it's sort of seen as a promising way to address this other highly complex issue that is climate change. But there's also been some academic discussion of using Section 15 of the Charter, which protects our right to equality under the law. Now, invoking this right seems particularly appropriate in light of the fact that climate change, it doesn't impact everyone equally. It has a disproportionate impact on vulnerable individuals and marginalized communities, as well as on young people, which I will extrapolate on later. It's really no surprise that the main climate cases, and in this sense, I mean cases against government, as obviously there are also cases against private corporations, have been based on these important rights in combination with other legal arguments. And these cases include the case of Mathur et al. Versus Her Majesty and Right of Ontario, which I've had the privilege of working on with my colleagues at EcoJustice and co-counsel at Stockwoods LLP. So this brings me to discuss why this case was launched against Ontario in particular. So as many of you already know, and I apologize if this is not news to you, Ontario had previously set 3 relatively ambitious targets regarding the reduction of GHG emissions for 2020, 2030, and 2050, pursuant to the Climate Change Act. But after the 2018 election, the new Ford government repealed that act and its targets and replaced them with one singular weakened target for 2030. This target was mandated by the Cap and Trade Cancellation Act, but laid out in the Made in Ontario Environment Plan. Now, just to contextualize what that change means, this new target allows for 30 megatons more in annual GHG emissions between 2018 and 2030. So this is equivalent to roughly the emissions of 7 million additional passenger vehicles per year. So it is a significant change. And not only is this target, it's highly inadequate in terms of the imperative that we're all aware of to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, but Ontario is also backtracking on its climate ambition at a time where the global consensus is that governments have to do more, not less, on climate change. So that concludes the contextual part, and now I'd like to get to what is our case actually about. And you've heard already, the respondent in this case is Ontario. As for the applicants, they're a group of 7 amazing Ontario youth. They range in age from 13 to 25, and they live in various parts of the province. You'll hear from 2 of them today from Sudbury and Ontario, but there are others from Thunder Bay, from Peterborough, from Tiny, so they're all over the province. They've had different experiences with and concerns about climate change, and they've all been taking action in their personal capacity. But what brings them together on this case is their concern that their government is not doing enough in the face of a climate crisis that threatens to have devastating impacts on their own and on future generations. And you'll be hearing from Alex and Sophia in just a few minutes, so I'll let them speak about why they're involved and inspire you as they have done for me. But on a procedural note, from a legal point of view, it's important to note that these youth are bringing the case as public interest applicants, meaning that they're not claiming that they have been directly harmed by climate change themselves, but they're bringing this case on behalf of all Ontarians who risk facing disastrous climate change. And as I mentioned before, this lawsuit invokes the protections of Sections 7 and 15 of the Charter, which safeguards Ontarians' rights to life, liberty, security, as well as equality. So what does that mean? There are many ways in which climate change threatens to impact these rights. Science tells us that allowing the world to warm beyond 1.5 degrees will cause an increase in frequency and severity of heat waves, of wildfires and floods, as well as the further spread of infectious disease, which is a timely topic, algal blooms, and toxic contamination in lakes. And these climate impacts will affect Ontarians' physical and mental health, their freedom to make fundamental choices and carry out traditional activities, and their ability to earn a livelihood, and it will even claim some of their lives. And we also know that these impacts will disproportionately affect certain people and communities based on existing vulnerabilities or certain circumstances that make them more at risk, such as young people, the elderly, individuals with pre-existing health conditions or disabilities, those living in poverty, and Indigenous communities. But on another side of inequality, climate impacts will also affect youth and future generations more, given that these impacts will significantly increase over time. So there's various forms of inequality that comes into play here. In terms of evidence, we'll be developing our own record, but it's important to note that we have this advantage where we can rely on highly authoritative climate science in the form of IPCC reports, which I'm sure you're all aware of. So we've seen in climate litigation throughout the world that courts have given weight to these reports on the state of the science on various important issues, like the linkages between GHG emissions, degrees of global warming, and then the impacts that will occur. And also distinguishing, what really is the difference between a 2-degree and a 1.5 degree warmer world in terms of impacts. So it's really useful for lawyers to be able to rely on these types of things. So essentially, our argument is that the Ontario 2030 target is unconstitutional because it greatly exceeds the province's share of global and Canadian emissions, and it's in line with a dangerous degree of global warming where the impacts on Ontarians' rights that I described will be greatly amplified. Because of this, we've asked the court to declare that Ontario's target is unconstitutional, to strike it down, and to order that a new science-based target be established. We've asked them to order that Ontario revise its climate plan, and finally, to recognize that Section 7, our most basic rights, includes the right to a stable climate, capable of providing youth and future generations with a sustainable future. Because what does the right to life mean if you don't have a climate within which you can live? So now that you know a bit more about our case, let's turn to what's happened so far and what's next for the case. We launched the case in November 2019, obviously in a pre-pandemic world, hoping to secure a decision as quickly as possible given the timelines of a climate crisis. We don't have many years in which to act. We had 11 at the time that we launched the case. Now, unfortunately, Ontario has recently filed a motion to strike against our case. This basically means that they want to get the case kicked out before we can discuss it on the merits, because they claim that it has no chance of success. We obviously disagree, and we've seen many cases throughout the world where courts have disagreed on that aspect. So we're working in order to respond to that motion to ensure that our applicants get their day in court. Now, as currently scheduled, the hearing on Ontario's motion will be in mid-July. So obviously, we have no way of telling if that will be an in-person or a virtual hearing or whether it'll be pushed back. But in the meantime, we're hard at work to ensure that we succeed both at this preliminary stage and when our full case is heard by the court. So hopefully that gave you a bit more insight into what our case is about, but now I'm excited to hear from our applicants who are the true heroes of the day, Alex and Sophia. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Danielle. That was really great and insightful. I'm sure everyone learned a lot from that, and it was a great introduction to the next presenters who I forgot to introduce at the beginning, so I apologize, but I think it's a great way to introduce them now, just so you have them fresh in your mind, you know exactly who they are. I have two of the youth who filed a lawsuit against the Ford government, as Danielle was explaining. one is Alex Neufeldt, and she is a 24-year-old entrepreneur and climate activist who joined CCL in 2017. She also owns a dress rental company called Closet in the Sky, and she's based in Ottawa, and she's part of the Ottawa chapter. I actually rented a dress from her one time. She has a really nice selection, so definitely recommend. And I'd also like to present Sophia Mathur, and she is a grade 7 student from Sudbury. And she started lobbying in CCL at just 11 years old, which is really impressive. She's also an active striker for Greta Thunberg's Fridays for Future initiative, primarily in the greater Sudbury region, where she serves on the steering committee. So I'm very excited to hear their presentation and their take on the lawsuit being filed. Hello?
Alex goes first.
I go first? Okay, sorry.
Okay, there you go.
Okay, perfect. So thank you for the introduction, Vanessa. My name is Alex. I'm here joining you from Algonquin territory in Ottawa. And yeah, like Vanessa said, I'm an entrepreneur. Climate change is very scary to me because I'm a very ambitious person. I have a lot of plans, and this might sound selfish, but climate change basically has the potential to thwart everything I want to do in my life. So that is obviously a scary thing to have to contend with, and that's why I have been really interested in combating climate change and getting involved with organizations and activities designed to fight climate change. And I really think that Ontario should absolutely be a leader in fighting climate change, creating green jobs, and being open for business, but green businesses in an ecologically sustainable way. Unfortunately, the usual techniques of writing letters and being angry on social media have not been effective at convincing the Ford government to do something about this. So we've had to bring in the big guns and sue. So yeah, that's why I'm involved in this case. I don't know if that was 5 minutes, but I've more or less said what I wanted to say. So I'll turn it over to Sophia now.
Hi, I'm just gonna start off by saying big thank you, and I'm gonna make this short too, but if you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments. Hi, my name is Sophia Mathur. I'm 13 years old and I'm from Sudbury, Ontario, and I started lobbying with Citizen Climate Lobby since I was 7 years old, and well, as said, I'm a part of the lawsuit suing Doug Ford and the Ontario government, so I'm going to share my opinion on this. So I just want to say that climate change is real, it threatens us all, and Premier Ford's government is not doing enough to curb greenhouse gas emissions in the province. And that threatens to rob my future. I'm a part of this lawsuit because I want my future back. When I grow up, I want to be a lawyer, and I also have lots of other hopes and dreams. And I want a chance to make that come true. And I'm scared that because of the climate emergency, I won't get that chance. So that's why I'm doing everything I can to take action. I've been speaking at conferences and rallies, and I'm a part of this lawsuit. And recently, Doug Ford put a motion to strike on this case, which, as explained, it means that he does not want this case to go forward. But I keep on pushing through, and I know that we can still make a difference no matter what happens. So thank you everyone for being here today, because all of you guys are making such a great difference in lobbying politicians and showing the youth that the adults care about this. So thank you, and if you have any questions, you can always ask in the comments. Thank you guys.
Thank you so much for that, Sophia and Alex. That was great to hear, and I'm sure everyone is very inspired, especially from your initiative too. That's just absolutely incredible. With that said, we've pretty much wrapped up the presentations for this segment. If anyone has any questions for any of the presenters, feel free to comment in the chat, or you can just unmute yourself and raise your hand and ask whatever questions you might have.
Vanessa, they cannot unmute themselves, so they
Oh.
must put the questions in the box, text box.
Okay, sounds good. So, I mean, we have a comment from Nick, and he said, the energy from the youth protest movement has been my inspiration. It is driving climate action at this time. And yes, I can agree more. That is wonderful. So another question that we have is from Joanne, and she just asked, how can we push the Ford government movement harder? Or just action against the Ford government, how can we push that further?
Sorry, who are you asking? Are you asking me to comment on that?
She didn't really specify, but yeah, if you would like, Dr. Sachs, you can definitely answer that question.
Well, it is standard political activism. Anyone who really has the time and energy, you could read Cochland, Cochland, which is a story of how the Koch brothers spent $1 billion to buy the 2016 American election and the techniques that they use. But it comes down to bombarding politicians who are, well, they're susceptible to being influenced. So we, people who are fighting for climate, don't have the deep pockets of the oil industry. What we have is power in numbers, and politicians are very strongly influenced by what they hear from their constituents. The problem is that they mostly hear from their constituents some version of what's in it for me. They hardly ever hear about climate or longer term issues. And so, especially if you live in a conservative riding, you have it's really important to speak to your elected representative. Backbenchers may not think they can do anything, but they need to hear from constituents that this is important. I know that CCL teaches people how to get in touch with your representative. Sometimes it takes a number of tries, but they do have constituency days where they meet with constituents, and especially if you can get a group together, go and talk to your politician, write to the local newspaper, if there's still any local newspapers after this. Anything else that you can do to get public attention, to get other groups involved. It's much more powerful if you can get many voices from the riding. So build collaboration and speak up. And in terms of my presentation, I think that Kathy's going to be posting it somewhere, because I definitely gave it to her. Oh, in terms of, and in the chat, there's some information about Shift, which is doing training on how to go after your bank and your pension company.
Sounds great, thank you. And I really like what you mentioned just about lobbying in general. So I remember when I first started lobbying with CCL, I could tell that the government officials we were lobbying were definitely receptive to what we were saying, because we were volunteer lobbyists and we were doing this because it's something that we value and we care about. And that's very different from a lot of the paid lobbyists that we usually see. So that was a really good point that you touched on. I really appreciate that. We also have another question for you, Dr. Sachs. So can you please comment on, this is from Tom Cullen. Can you please comment on the viability of the motion to strike? Is there a role for citizens while the case is in the courts?
Not really. Although other than fundraising, I'm sure there's always fundraising. The courts are not influenced by public opinion very much. I mean, I think they are influenced to some extent. That's why I went through the history of the tobacco litigation very briefly, that I don't think that tobacco decision would have been possible while tobacco was popular and considered necessary by most people. But no, you can't influence the court with political action. However, you can certainly be preparing for whatever happens next. And while the court is considering the issue, there's lots of opportunities to raise the conversation. That's one of the things the court case gives you, is a chance to be talking about, this is coming up in court, this is why it's so important, this is why it matters. And if you lose the motion to strike, which is a real possibility, then that opportunity will be over. So I would say use the opportunity right now to reach the public as much as possible. Don't be thinking of trying to influence the judges. Although if you should, you don't know who the judges are going to be. Judges, like other people, are influenced by by what their children tell them, but they would consider it quite improper for people to be lobbying them directly.
Perfect. Thank you so much for answering that question. And that's definitely insightful. So another question that we have is from Jan. So it says here, why is the schedule of the lawsuit? I assume it's what is the schedule? So does someone want to answer, I guess, when we're planning on proceeding with the lawsuit?
Yeah, so I can answer that. Because Ontario has now filed this motion to strike, we can't schedule any further hearings on the merits until that preliminary question has been dealt with, because essentially if they win, our case stops there. So currently the hearing on the motion to strike is, I believe, July 13th. As I was saying earlier, hard to tell at this moment whether that will go forward and in what form. But until we have that decision, unfortunately, we can't go any further with the case. We'll still be working on it on our end, but we won't be able to secure a hearing date on the merits of the case. And this is unfortunate because we structured the case with a particular procedure so that it would go as quickly as possible. And we were hoping to get a hearing date within a year. This now seems, very unlikely given the motion to strike. So unfortunately, it's delaying any kind of positive decision that we could achieve with this case. So it's unfortunate, but not surprising. Cases like this have often faced motions to strike or similar procedures in their jurisdictions. So it's not a surprise for us, but it's just one more hurdle that we will have to get over to succeed.
Yeah, and sorry, just a follow-up question to what you just said, Danielle. Did you kind of anticipate that the motion to strike would happen, or were you kind of optimistic in terms of you would kind of meet your timeline that you were projecting?
Unfortunately, this is something that I think anyone bringing a climate case has to expect. As EcoJustice has also been involved with, other cases against the Ford government where procedural tactics like this have been employed. So, it's also not a surprise from the organization's viewpoint. But I think any government that you would sue would probably try this type of tactic to try and get the case thrown out. In a way, our case is a novel type of case. So it's not an illogical thing to do on their part, but the threshold that you have to meet in order to succeed is quite a bit lower than the final merits of the case. So we're hoping that we have designed the case in a way that we will get past that first hurdle and be able to be heard on the full extent of the case.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That clarifies a lot. So for the next question, it's by Ron Moore, and he's wondering, can the public join the lawsuit as supporters?
We've heard this a lot, and I really appreciate all the enthusiasm to be involved. Unfortunately, not as applicants to the case. The case has already been launched, and it's already been launched on behalf of a group of public interest litigants, as I was mentioning before. But nothing's stopping you from saying that you support the case. I believe our communications team had a hand-raising campaign recently where they were asking people to stand with our applicants, just to put more public pressure. Obviously, as Dr. Sachs was explaining, there's a difference between the influence you can have in the courtroom and in the political domain. So that would be more in the political domain, but you can support, you can amplify the messages, you can amplify the youth voices in this case by sharing their stories. So there's many ways in which the public can be involved, but not necessarily within the courtroom, unfortunately. That's the limits of this type of case.
Right, but there is another opportunity right now for people to influence the federal government, which is the ultimate objective of the thing. Because the federal government is making, multi-billion-dollar decisions right now about what the recovery is going to look like, how they're going to spend all this money that you young people are going to be expected to pay back. And there is a very fierce debate we hear going on in Ottawa about whether to try to reestablish the old economy or to pivot to the new. So right now there are at least two letters that you could endorse and send on to the federal government. One is, both of which I've been involved in. One is from the Climate Caucus, which is a group of mayors and councillors from across the country And if you know a mayor or councillor of any municipality, encourage them to join the Climate Caucus and encourage them to sign that letter. Other people can sign as supporters, but really municipal elected representatives are the key. So it's climatecaucus.ca. You can find that letter there, or you can also find it on my website, saxfax.com, on the blog page, and I'll put it in the chat when I have a minute. The second letter is from a business community, Clean 50, which is a group devoted to clean capitalism. And again, this is also on their website, and it's on my in my website and the blog. And again, they're asking everyone to, if you read the letter, if you agree with it, endorse it, send it on to your MP and to the Prime Minister's office. And what there's, as you probably know, the three most environmentally conscious federal cabinet ministers are working on the recovery plan. And they've been really clear, they need strong public support. They've got to have people from all over demanding a green recovery and not just, you know, $40 billion for the oil industry. So there's a lot, in political lobbying, one of the key things is to know when there's a window for action, when are decisions being made. A lot of the time, decisions aren't being made and you can't have much influence, but right now, some of the biggest decisions are being made right now. So if you don't do anything else today, please endorse at least one of those letters and send it on to your MP in the Prime Minister's office. And I'll put the links in the chat.
That would be wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Sachs. I'm sure everyone would appreciate that and would love to check it out. And definitely important to amplify our voices and support these types of movements.
We have to be prepared.
Extinction Rebellion, Dr. Sachs.
Well, I'm not highly educated about it. But the idea of trying new things, remember, we're late in the game, we're losing. And so one of the ways to influence people is to be in the streets. Even, so I don't know how many of you would read it, Larry Rock, who's the largest money manager in the world, he manages $7 trillion, sent a truly stunning letter in, I think it was January of this year, to the CEOs of all the companies that he invests in, and one of the calling for climate action, climate disclosure. One of the things he called out as the reason he was doing that was youth being in the streets, that the public opinion change. Remember, it's a moral case. And so people being in the streets protesting nonviolently helps change the moral case, especially if you have faith groups and a wide variety of people. So yes, it really matters. It's being noticed, it's having an impact. It's hard to do when we're all locked in our houses, but as soon as it's possible to be out, we need to be out. We need to be visible. We need to be in people's faces. We need to be saying, yes, some short-term inconvenience is worthwhile because what's coming is horrifying. And we still have a little time to fix it.
Very good. Thank you so much. Definitely valuable insights. And it seems, so I'm going to try and summarize a couple of the questions because a few of them have to do with the motion to strike. So some questions are asking, how will it be decided, on what basis? Is it a procedural move? So just kind of to answer some of those questions, if you guys can.
Well, it's definitely a procedural move, and it's just what you'd expect governments to do. And remember, as I said, justiciability is the biggest problem. I mean, there are other cases. There's a lot of good reasons for courts not being the place to make these decisions. And it is perfectly legitimate for a government, I mean, even a good government, to say, this isn't the right place for this case. The Ford government's made no secret of its hostility to all kinds of climate action. Although I must admit, I didn't expect even them to put things like science-based in scare quotes, but there you are. So yeah, totally predictable, totally normal. I would have been shocked if there hadn't been one. It's hard to pass these on these kinds of cases, but it's not impossible. So don't get your hopes up too much. Don't be too disappointed if it fails, but if it passes this, it's a huge win.
Right, perfect. And also another question regarding the subject matter is, what is the legal basis for the motion to strike?
That courts aren't the right places to be making this kind of decision is fundamentally the issue. I mean, Danielle would know better, but that's usually what all of these are about.
Yeah, that's one of their main arguments. I mean, they've made a number of arguments to, essentially they're saying that there's no chance that our case will succeed. And they've enumerated various points on which they think that it would be impossible for this kind of case to succeed. So essentially we would just have to show, you know, if you take all of the facts as true, yes, this case could succeed on a legal basis. You know, a motion to strike is not a point at which we have to prove our evidence. That would be later on in the proceeding. So what the courts have to do is say, you know, if it's true, everything that they're alleging, is it then capable of success? So the bar is quite a bit lower than a final decision. So we're hoping that at this point in time, we've adequately prepared for this so that we can get on to the next stage. Obviously, it remains a real risk and we're taking it seriously. We're not assuming that we would win without putting up a fight. So that's what we're currently doing is preparing to put in our own arguments to counter Ontario's.
Perfect, thank you. And sorry, it's 3:29 now, so I just would like to squeeze in one last question that I really like. So it's from Jerry, and it's going to the youth. So what advice do youth want to give other youth in regards to this movement?
I can take that question if Alex wants to too. I'll make this really short. My advice to other youth is to get out there, put yourself out there, because youth are really empowering in this movement. I believe that youth can make a strong difference in this, and that they should just get out there, go to rallies, show the world that that youth can make a difference, because youth can. And I know personally that me and my friends, when we work together, that everyone feels very empowered to see youth a part of this movement. So I just wanted to say you can empower yourself if you're, you can empower everyone around you, and get out there.
Perfect, thanks so much, Sophia. That was beautiful to hear. Alex, did you want to add anything?
Sure. I agree with everything Sophia said, obviously. Another piece of advice I would say is don't be afraid, especially not of the haters. You have a powerful voice, and there will be people who stand with you, but you just got to get up and speak and find people who have things in common with you, who will lift you up and get you through the tough times when when you hear people pushing back, because people push back against youth too.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Alex. That was great. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Dr. Sachs, Danielle, Sophia, and Alex, you guys were wonderful. For everyone, Dr. Sachs has provided the link to her website, and you could check out the 2 letters, the Climate Caucus and Clean 50, if you want to get more involved. And thank you so much for your time.